Section 1 of the Hollow Tree and the Deep Woods book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Elizabeth Parsons. The Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book by Albert Bigelow Paine. Section 1, The Little Lady and the Storyteller, the Hollow Tree People. The Little Lady and the Storyteller. The reader is introduced to them. In the house of many windows, which stands in a large city and is sometimes called a flat, by people who, because they are grown up, do not know any better, live the little lady and the storyteller. The little lady is 4 years old, going on 5, and is fond of stories. This makes her and the storyteller good friends. They mostly sit in the firelight after supper, and while the little lady is being undressed, they tell each other all that has happened since morning. Then the little lady looks into the fire and says, "Now tell me a story." Sometimes she wants a new story, sometimes one of the old ones, which must be told always the same, because the little lady, like a good many grown-up people, does not care for new and revised editions, but wants the old stories in the old words that sound real and true. Sometimes the storyteller forgets or improves on his plots, but the little lady never forgets and never fails to set the storyteller right. The Hollow Tree People. The little lady is introduced to the coon, the possum, and the old black crow. When the storyteller came home last night, the little lady had a great deal to tell him. During the afternoon she had built in one corner of the sitting room a house for her 3 dolls, with a separate room for each. Of course, the house was not a house at all, but only a plan on the floor made with blocks and books. At one side she had laid out a large parlor room, where her family of 3, Hetty, Annabel, and the rubber boy, could meet together and talk. "Why," said the storyteller, "that reminds me of the crow, the coon, and the possum." "What did they do? Tell me that story," commanded the little lady, promptly forgetting her day's work and pulling the storyteller toward his chair. The storyteller stirred the fire and looked into the blaze a moment, thinking. The little lady climbed up into his lap and waited. She was used to the storyteller. "Tell it," she said presently. So then he told her the story of the 3 friends. Once upon a time, in the far depths of the big deep woods, there was a big hollow tree with 3 big hollow branches. In one of these there lived a coon, in another a possum, and in the third a big black crow. "But crows don't live in hollow trees," said the little woman, who happened to be passing. "This one did," replied the storyteller. "I suppose styles have changed some since then." The hollow tree below was rather dark, so they all used it for a parlor, and only met in there now and then to dust off their things or when company came. Now the crow and the coon and the possum were all very fond of good living and mostly of the same things. They were good friends, too, and they often made plans to catch young chickens and other game and carried them out together. Between trips they would sit in their doors and pass the time of day across to each other, just like folks. Well, one winter, about 2 weeks after New Year's, it came on to snow in the woods where the hollow tree was, and it snowed, and it snowed, and it snowed. This was long before sleds or skates, and when big snows always came up over people's windows and snowed them in. And this is what happened to the crow and the coon and the possum. They were snowed in. Well, they rather liked it at first, for they had a good deal left over from New Year's dinner, and they used to get together downstairs in the parlor and spread lunch and pitch the bones under the table and talk and tell stories and wonder how long the snow would last. But they never counted on its lasting half so long as it did. Every day they would look out of an upstairs window that they had to see if the storm wasn't over. And every day it was just the same, and there was no sign of clearing up. Then they began to get scared, for their cupboards were nearly empty, and there was no chance to catch any more game. At last every scrap was gone, and there wasn't a thing to eat in the house. The possum went to bed and pulled up the covers and tried to sleep so he would forget it. The coon sat up in a rocking chair and rocked on purpose to think about it, for he was a great hand to plan, and he thought maybe he could work it out some way. The crow didn't do either, but walked about his house, picking up first one thing and then another, as people do sometimes when they don't do anything else. But the crow was luckier than most people who do that, for by and by he picked up quite a big paper sack with something in it. Then he untied it and looked into it quite a while, thinking. It was more than half full of cornmeal, and pretty soon he remembered that he had carried it off once when he was passing Mr. Man's pantry window, not because he wanted it, but because he was a crow, and crows carry off anything that isn't too big, whether they want it or not. Then he hunted around some more and found another sack with some flour in it that he had picked up once in the same way. Then he found some little bags of pepper and salt and a lump of butter. "My," said the little lady, "but he carried off a lot of things." Yes, crows always do, and hide them that way. Well, he didn't say anything, but he slipped downstairs and gathered up some of the chicken bones under the table and some pieces of bark and sticks, and brought them up to his own part of the house and shut the door. Then he kindled a little fire in the stove with the sticks and opened his outside door a crack and got a skillet full of snow and put it on, and when the snow melted he dropped in the chicken bones and let them stew, and then a little of the flour and some pepper and salt and stirred it, and he had some nice gravy. By and by the possum and coon smelt it cooking and thought it came from a farmhouse, and the possum turned over twice and thought of everything he had ever heard of to make people go to sleep, and the coon rocked harder and harder. Then Mr. Crow poured the gravy into a bowl and set it back on the stove to keep warm while he stirred up some of the cornmeal in some more melted snow with a little pinch of salt and a little piece of the butter. When it was all stirred good, he put it into the skillet and patted it down, and when it was baked nice and brown on both sides it was as good a Johnny cake as you ever tasted. He laughed to himself a minute, and then he slipped downstairs again and set the table. He put on the bowl of gravy in the center and cut the Johnny cake in 3 pieces. Then he called out as loud as he could, "Come to dinner." The possum jumped straight up in bed and then lay down again quick, for he thought the crow was playing a joke on him, which he was, though not the kind he thought. The coon jumped too, and then went to rocking again, for he thought the same thing. So Mr. Crow opened the possum's door quick and the coon's door quick, and let the smell of the nice chicken gravy go right up into their rooms. Then he laughed out loud and called again, "Come to dinner while it's hot." And down they came, for they couldn't stand that smell. But when they saw the Johnny cake, they thought it was a joke again, for they had never seen any before and didn't know what it was like. "Dip in and try," said the crow, and he broke off a piece of his cake and dipped it in the bowl of gravy and began to eat it. So then the possum broke off a piece of his Johnny cake and dipped it in the gravy and began to eat it. And the coon broke off a piece of his Johnny cake and dipped it in the gravy and began to eat too. And then the crow dipped again, and the possum dipped again, and the coon dipped again. "It's good," said the possum. "Yes, it's good," said the coon. "Where did you get it?" But the crow did not tell them, and so they dipped and ate, until they dipped and ate it all up. "Drop in again tomorrow," said the crow when they were done. So the next day they came again, and the next day they came again, and every day after that they came, until the storm was over and the snow was most gone, and Mr. Crow never did tell them the secret of it until once when he wanted to ask a great favor of Mr. Coon and Mr. Possum, but that is too long to tell about tonight. The storyteller looked down at the little lady. She was sound asleep. End of section 1.
Section 2 of the Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kimberly Welch, Tampa. The Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book by Albert Bigelow Paine. Section 2. A Joke All Around about Hollow Tree people and their ways. "You may tell me some more about the coon and the possum and the old black crow," said the little lady, settling herself comfortably and indicating by the motion of her body that she wanted the storyteller to rock. "They lived in three big hollow limbs of a big hollow tree, you know, and used to meet together sometimes in their parlor and talk." Why, yes, of course. The storyteller did know this colony, and hurriedly tried to recall some one of their many adventures. Out of the mists of that long ago time, when all animals and men spoke one language, and mingled more or less sociably together, came presently a dim memory that cleared and brightened as it came, and took form at last in something which the storyteller told to the little lady as Mr. Coon's Bad Cold. One day, early in March, and during a long wet spell, the coon caught a bad cold. The next morning he stayed in bed, and pulled up the covers, and was cross and too sick to go out. This made extra work for the crow and the possum, who, of course, had to bring him in his meals and take care of him. And Mr. Coon, who found how nice it was to be waited on, thought he would take his own time about getting well. He was sick so long that by and by it set Mr. Crow to thinking, and one day, all of a sudden, he was taken ill too, and coughed and took on, and called across to the others that he was sick and couldn't come out either. This made still more work for the possum, who now had to catch game for three, besides waiting on sick folks and taking care of their houses. So by and by Mr. Possum got to thinking some, as well as the others, and one morning, while the crow and the coon were lying all snug in bed and laughing to themselves at the trick they were playing, and thinking of the nice breakfast they were to have, they heard all at once the possum calling out that hard work and exposure had been too much for him, and that he was sicker now than both of them put together. Of course, they had to call back to him that they were sorry, and of course they were sorry in one way. And then each of them lay down to see which would be the first to starve out. Mr. Possum had a little the best of it at first, because he had brought in enough the night before to last him for a few meals, but being very greedy, he soon ate it all up, and before long was just as hungry as either the coon or the crow, and maybe hungrier. Every day they all grew emptier and emptier. Sometimes Mr. Crow would get up and slip to the door to see if the possum or the coon was not starting out for food. Sometimes Mr. Possum would peep out to see if the coon and the crow were not going. Sometimes Mr. Coon would look out to see if the crow and the possum hadn't started. Once they all saw each other and jumped back like a flash. That night Mr. Possum decided that he couldn't stand it any longer. He was so thin that his skin hung on him like a bag, and he hardly had strength enough to curl his tail. So he made a plan to slip through the parlor downstairs and out the door at the bottom of the tree to find a good supper just for himself. A little after dark, when he thought the others were asleep, he got up softly and dressed himself and took his shoes in his hand. He was afraid to put them on, for fear he would wake up the crow and the coon going downstairs. Well, he slipped down softly, and was just about halfway to the door when biff! He ran right against something in the dark. "But I thought you once said possums could see in the dark," interrupted the little lady, sitting up straight. "They can in just common dark, but this, you see, was hollow tree dark, which is the very darkest dark there is. So he couldn't see a wink, and down he came, and down came the other thing too, till pretty soon, biff! They struck something else, and down all three things came over and over, rattledy clatter to the bottom of the stairs, right on out of the door into the moonlight. And what do you suppose was there besides Mr. Possum? "I know," said the little lady eagerly. "The 'Coon and the old black crow?" Exactly. Both of them dressed and looking foolish and half starved, and each with his shoes in his hand. They had all slipped down softly to get something to eat, because they were so hungry, and, of course, when they looked at each other standing there, they all knew very well that none of them had been sick, except Mr. 'Coon a little right at first. After they had looked at each other for about a minute, they all began to laugh, and they laughed and laughed till they cried, and rolled on the ground, and kept on laughing, to think how they all had fooled each other, and been fooled themselves. Then they all hurried off on a big hunt for game, and didn't get back till sunrise. End of section 2. Recording by Kimberly Welch, Tampa. Section 3 of the Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kimberly Welch, Tampa. The Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book by Albert Bigelow Paine. Section 3. Some New Acquaintances. The little lady is introduced to Mr. Jack Rabbit during a very exciting experience with Mr. Dog, the first adventure of Jack Rabbit. Once upon a time, Mr. Jack Rabbit got up very early and set out for a morning walk. It was bright and sunny, and Mr. Rabbit was feeling so well that he walked and walked. Every little ways he stopped and talked to the robins and bluebirds that were up early too, until by and by he didn't know how far away from home he really was. Did he know the way? Asked the little lady. Oh, yes, he knew the way, because you can't lose Mr. Jack Rabbit, no matter what you do. But talking along and not thinking, he had forgotten about its being so far. He was just going to turn back, though, when all of a sudden there was a great loud bark right behind him that made him jump right straight up in the air and commence running before his feet touched the ground. He didn't stop to ask any questions. He knew that Mr. Dog was out early, too, and that he'd found his tracks and was a comin' lickety-split. What does that mean, lickety-split? I don't know exactly, but Mr. Dog always runs that way when he chases Jack Rabbit, and Mr. Rabbit knew he had no time to waste. He ran faster than Mr. Dog at first, and got far enough ahead so that when directly he saw Mr. Robin on a limb, he slacked up a little minute and said, "Mr. Dog's coming to call, and I'm going home to get my house ready." Then pretty soon he saw Mr. Bluebird, but he didn't have time to pause again. "Where are you going so fast, Mr. Rabbit?" said the Bluebird. "To get ready for Mr. Dog. He's coming to call," said the Rabbit, as he went by like a streak. Then a little further on he met Mr. Turtle. "Hi there!" called the Turtle. "Where are you going so fast, Mr. Rabbit?" "Dog coming. Clean house," shouted Jack Rabbit, most out of breath. That made the Turtle laugh, 'cause Mr. Turtle is old and smart, and he knew why the Rabbit was running so fast. "Was the Rabbit so afraid of Mr. Dog?" asked the little lady. "He was that, but he didn't want anybody to know if he could help it, and especially Mr. Dog. Well, pretty soon Mr. Dog came by where Mr. Robin was, and he called up, "Hello, Mr. Robin. Has Mr. Jack Rabbit passed this way?" "Why, yes, Mr. Dog, and he stopped a little minute to say that you were coming to see him, and then he had to hurry home to have his house ready." That kind of surprised Mr. Dog, 'cause he thought the Rabbit was afraid of him, but he kept right on till he came to the Bluebird. "Did Mr. Rabbit come this way?" he called up without stopping. "Yes, sir, and hurried right on to have his house ready for you," said the bluebird. That surprised Mr. Dog more and more, and he began to think that after all maybe the rabbit didn't know what he wanted of him, and what did he want of him? Well, I'd expect it was about the same as the wolf wanted of Red Riding Hood, and Jack Rabbit was so far away from home and getting so tired that there's no telling what might have happened if it hadn't been for Mr. Turtle. Mr. Turtle was a good friend to Jack Rabbit, 'cause once he beat him in a foot race by playing a trick, and he'd always felt a little sorry for it. So when Mr. Dog came along, he got right in the way and said, "Hi there. Hold on, Mr. Dog, or you'll get there before Mr. Rabbit is ready for you. He just passed, and he said he had to clean up before you came. I s'pose he wants to get up a fine dinner, too." Well, that settled it. Mr. Dog stopped and said he wasn't in any hurry at all, but was just running a little because it was a nice morning and he felt well. Of course, he said he didn't want to get there before Mr. Rabbit was ready for him, and then he trotted along comfortably, thinking how he would eat the rabbit's fine dinner first, and then there would be time enough for Mr. Rabbit himself afterward. So, when he got to Jack Rabbit's house, he straightened his vest and his necktie a little, and then he knocked and turned around and whistled while he was waiting for Mr. Rabbit to come to the door. But Jack Rabbit didn't come to the door. He opened an upstairs window and said, "Why, it's Mr. Dog! Sit right down on the porch, Mr. Dog, till I get my house ready and the dinner cooked." So Mr. Dog sat down and lit his pipe and smoked and looked at the scenery, while Mr. Rabbit inside, he laughed and lay down on the bed and finally went to sleep. Mr. Dog sat there and smoked and wished the rabbit would hurry and let him in, 'cause he wanted to get home to his folks, and it was a long way to travel. By and by he called up and asked him if dinner wasn't ready yet. That waked Jack Rabbit up, and he looked out the window and said that he'd had bad luck with his biscuit and dinner would be late. Then Mr. Dog said he'd come in while he was waiting, but the rabbit said the house was full of smoke and he wouldn't think of letting his company sit inside such a pleasant day. Well, Mr. Dog, he sat, and Mr. Jack Rabbit laughed and went to sleep again. And by it got so late that Mr. Dog knew if he didn't go home pretty soon, he'd catch it when he got there. So he called up again to Mr. Rabbit and said that he'd take anything he happened to have in the house, and that he didn't care much for biscuit anyway. But Jack Rabbit said he would never show his face again if he let his company do that, and that it was a perfect shame that Mr. Dog had waited so long when he had so far to go. He said that his stove didn't draw worth a cent, and that his fire had gone out once, and he hadn't got it started again yet. Then Mr. Dog didn't wait to hear another word, but just set out for home lickety-split, with Mr. Jack Rabbit rolling on the bed and laughing to see him go. "Come again, Mr. Dog," he called after him. "Come again when you can't stay so long." But Mr. Dog didn't say a word, or look round, for he knew by Jack Rabbit's laughing so loud and saying to come when he couldn't stay so long, that he'd been fooling him all the time. "And did he ever go to Jack Rabbit's house again?" asked the little lady. "Well, not right away. He didn't go out much of anywhere after that for a while, because people made fun of him and kept calling out when he went by, 'Come again, Mr. Dog. Come again when you can't stay so long.'" End of section 3. Recording by Kimberly Welch, Tampa.
Section 4 of the Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Parsons. The Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book by Albert Bigelow Paine. Section 4, Mr. Rabbit's Big Dinner. Mr. Jack Rabbit entertains the Hollow Tree people. An unwelcome guest arrives, causing some excitement. Once upon a time there came to the big hollow tree, where the coon and the possum and the old black crow lived, an invitation from Mr. Jack Rabbit for the three to dine with him next day. Nobody was going to be there, he said, but the turtle, and for them to come early so's to have a nice long afternoon. He didn't need to say that, for the possum would have started right off if it had been polite, and the crow and the coon were both so excited that the coon commenced with pie first at supper, and the crow took his hat to get water in. Then they talked all the evening about their clothes and what they were going to wear, and the possum said he was afraid to look at his best suit for fear it was moth-eaten. And the coon and the crow rummaged through their bureaus and got out all their clean shirts so's to have one ready for the next day. In the morning they all got up long before daylight, and the possum looked out first and then called over to the others that there had been a light snow in the night, but that it was clear now and just cold enough to give a fellow a good appetite. He was going to eat a slim breakfast, he said, so's to be ready for a big dinner. They were all dressed and ready long before time, but they managed to stand it until about 10 o'clock, and then the possum said he was just naturally getting gray-headed waiting for that dinner, and off they started. Mr. Jack Rabbit had got up early, too, that morning, and had the table most set when they came. He had his sleeves rolled up and an apron on, and the way he was flying around and getting ready was a caution. The coon and the crow sat down in the parlor and looked at the album and some travel books they found on the table. But Mr. Possum was so hungry after his light breakfast that he could not keep out of the kitchen, where it smelled good, and stood around and talked to Jack Rabbit and asked him where he got his chickens, and if he thought Mr. Fox would spare him some, too, and if Mr. Rabbit had any trouble getting his biscuits to rise in cold weather. Then the rabbit gave the possum some new receipts, and Mr. Possum tasted of everything, a great big taste, making believe he wanted to see just how it was made, but really because he was almost starved and couldn't wait. Well, pretty soon Mr. Turtle straddled in, and everything was on the table, and they all sat down. The possum had tasted so much in the kitchen that he wasn't so starved as the coon and the crow, and behaved very politely and stepped on the coon's toe under the table because he ate so greedily, and whispered to the crow not to shovel the food about on his plate as if he were cleaning snow off a roof. They were all too busy to say much at first, but pretty soon they got to talking and telling stories, and Jack Rabbit told about the time that Mr. Dog chased him home, and how he kept Mr. Dog sitting out on the porch all the afternoon waiting for dinner to be ready. Then Mr. Turtle up and told about his stopping Mr. Dog that day, telling him that the rabbit had gone home to get dinner for him, and they all laughed, and the coon and the possum said that Mr. Dog thought they were afraid of him too. But the first time they got a chance, they were going to show him a few things that would open his eyes. That made the crow laugh till he coughed and strangled, and when the rabbit said he wasn't afraid either, the turtle laughed too. Then the coon and the possum and Mr. Jack Rabbit all pounded on the table and said, "Just show us, Mr. Dog, and you'll see whether we're afraid or not." And right then, as they said these words, there came a loud knock and a great big bow wow wow right at the door, and Mr. Jack Rabbit fell over backward, and Mr. Coon upset his coffee, and Mr. Possum, being stuffed so that he could hardly move, rolled under the table and fainted dead away. "Wasn't the crow and Mr. Turtle scared some too?" interrupted the little lady. "Not a bit. Mr. Dog is good friends with the crow and the turtle. Of course they were afraid some for the rabbit and the coon and the possum, but they didn't think Mr. Dog could get in because the door was locked. So they laughed and pounded on the table as the others had done and said, 'Oh yes, just show us, Mr. Dog, just show us, Mr. Dog.' That made the rabbit feel ashamed, 'cause he was in his own house, so he hopped up quick and marched over to the door and said, "Why, Mr. Dog, is that you out there?" Mr. Dog said it was, and that he had seen all the tracks in the snow, and just thought he'd like to take a hand in that big dinner himself. That made the hair on Mr. Coon's head stand right straight up, and Mr. Possum, who had rolled under the table, gave a groan and crawled over behind a long curtain, where he could faint and be covered up at the same time. Mr. Rabbit thought a little minute, and then said very politely, "It's just too bad, Mr. Dog. I'll declare it is. But every time you come, it seems like something happens to keep me from having your company. We've just got up from the table, and there isn't a thing left. And besides, Mr. Possum had a sick turn a minute ago, and we're all upside down and every which way." But Mr. Dog said he wasn't afraid, but that there'd be plenty for him to eat, and that he was a pretty good hand with sick folks himself. Then he gave another great loud bark and said, "You fooled me once, but you'll fool me no more. So lift up the latch and open the door." Mr. Dog talks poetry that way sometimes when he gets excited. But Jack Rabbit said he really couldn't think of inviting him in, the way things were, and that it would likely be after sundown before he'd be ready for him. Of course, he said Mr. Dog couldn't wait that long, he knew, and that he s'posed, after all, they'd have to do without his company this time. Then Mr. Dog said that his folks were away from home now, and that he could stay there all night if he wanted to, but that he didn't want to and didn't propose to. And then he gave another great big bow-wow-wow and said, "You fooled me once, but you can't again. Open the door or I'll break it in." Jack Rabbit and Mr. Coon both jumped when they heard that, and Mr. Possum almost died. It worried the Crow and the Turtle some, too, for they knew if he did break in the door, there'd be a big row and no telling how it would end. And just then Mr. Dog gave a big run and a jump against the door, and it squeaked and opened a little, so that the rabbit could see a streak of light through it, and Mr. Dog's yellow legs and tail. When he saw that Jack Rabbit just gave one spring and landed on the top shelf of his china closet, Mr. Possum jumped up and ran around the room and fainted in 2 or 3 different places, trying to find one that was safer than the other, and Mr. Coon scampered up the rabbit's new lace curtains and hung on to the pole for dear life. The Crow and the Turtle just kept still and got ready to argue some with Mr. Dog when he got in. Pretty soon he came, bang, against the door again, and this time a good deal harder than before, and it squeaked louder and the crack was wider, for Mr. Dog had jumped against it as hard as ever he could backward. And right there Mr. Dog made a mistake, for in just that little second, while the crack was open, the end of his tail got in it, and the door smacked right down on it, and there he was. "Ho!" said the little lady. "Was he caught tight?" He was that. The harder he pulled, the tighter it pinched, and he howled like a good fellow. You wouldn't have thought that such a little bit of his tail would make him howl so loud, but it did, and he couldn't get far enough away from the door to jump against it again. Well, Mr. Rabbit didn't let on that anything had happened, but just came down out of the china closet as cool as you please, with the dessert dishes on his arm. And the Possum said his sick turn had passed off, and the Coon came down from the curtain and mentioned that he always liked to take a little exercise during a heavy meal that way. Then they had dessert, and all the time Mr. Dog was making a big fuss outside. And by he began to beg and promise anything if they'd just let him loose. Mr. Rabbit called out to him that, being as his folks were away now, he needn't be in any hurry, and that he might just as well stay there all night if he wanted to. Then Mr. Dog called out to the Turtle and the Crow to prise open the door and let him get his tail out, but they both said that they couldn't think of being impolite with Jack Rabbit in his own house by sending off any of his friends that way. Well, pretty soon the Coon and the Possum said they must be going, they guessed, so Mr. Rabbit let them out the back door, and they went around and said goodbye to Mr. Dog and hoped he was having a nice time. And Mr. Dog told them, with tears in his eyes, that he was sorry to see them go, and that he hoped to meet them again. Then the 'Coon and the 'Possum both laughed and took a good look at Mr. Dog, for they had never been so close to him before in their lives. They kept on laughing and looking around as far as they could see, and said it was the best joke they had ever heard of. The Crow and the Turtle didn't go right away. They stayed and had a talk with Jack Rabbit first, so as to give the 'Coon and the 'Possum time to get home. By and by they bade good-bye to Mr. Rabbit and said they had a nice time, and went out the back door too, and when it was shut and locked tight, Jack Rabbit told Mr. Dog if he'd promise to go right home and behave himself and not to go gallivanting around the country, he'd let him loose. Mr. Dog promised and said his tail was numb clear up to his ears, and for Mr. Rabbit to please hurry. Then Jack Rabbit got a stick of stove wood and pried the door open a little wider, and Mr. Dog's tail came out just as the Turtle and the Crow stepped around the corner. "Was Mr. Dog mad at them?" asked the little lady anxiously. "Not very. He was too much ashamed, and besides, they walked along with him and said they were sorry and thought it was too bad the way he had been treated. And Mr. Crow said he'd have Mr. Dog over to his house for supper before long, which would be a good joke on the 'Coon and the 'Possum too, because they'd have to stay locked in their rooms." That made Mr. Dog perk up a little, but he didn't have much to say, and he didn't even look around when Mr. Jack Rabbit sat up in his window and called after them, "I fooled you once and I fooled you twice. If you come again, I'll fool you thrice." For Jack Rabbit could make up poetry too, sometimes when he felt well. End of section 4. Section 5 of the Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elizabeth Parsons. The Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book by Albert Bigelow Paine. Section 5. The Crow's Company. Mr. Crow gives a supper to Mr. Dog according to promise. "Well, you remember," said the storyteller, "that the Crow promised Mr. Dog he would have him over sometime for supper and play a joke on Mr. 'Coon and Mr. 'Possum. So one morning he sent word to Mr. Dog, and the same day gave it out to the 'Coon and the 'Possum, that we would have company for supper the next evening, and that he was going to set the big table in the parlor and have both of them come down and take supper with him too. He didn't tell them he was going to have Mr. Dog, and went around laughing to himself, because he thought it would be very funny for them to get all ready for a fine supper and then be afraid to come down when they found out who was there. Of course he meant to tell them before they came, because he didn't really want any fuss there in the parlor, especially when he had his good things on the table. Well, the 'Coon and the 'Possum said they'd come, and they guessed and guessed who it was that the Crow was going to have, but he wouldn't tell them. And by they began to suspect that maybe it was somebody that they didn't care much about. So they had a little private talk together and fixed up a way to be ready for him. After that they went around smiling a good deal, and the Crow thought it was on account of the big supper they were expecting, so he smiled too, and was busy getting ready for the fun next day. Well, next day about 5 o'clock, Mr. Dog came and knocked at the door downstairs, and Mr. Crow slipped down and let him in, and took him right up to the parlor where the supper was all on the table except the fried chicken, which he had left on the stove to keep hot. Mr. Dog took a seat and glanced round and said that everything looked good and smelled even better than it looked. The Crow liked to hear that, for he was always proud of his cooking, and he laughed all over and kept on laughing when he thought what a joke he was going to have right away on Mr. 'Coon and Mr. 'Possum. Then pretty soon he had everything ready, and said to Mr. Dog, "Now I'm going to call my friends down, but they won't come." And then they both laughed soft-like, for of course Mr. Dog knew all about the joke too. So then the Crow went up to the 'Possum's door and knocked and said, "Supper's ready. Company's here. Come down." "Who is your company, Mr. Crow?" "Oh, just home folks. Nobody but Mr. Dog. We've got fried chicken, and it's all ready." "I'm sorry, Mr. Crow, but I've just had company come too, and I couldn't come unless I brought my company." "Who is it?" said the Crow. "Nobody but home folks. Mr. Cat just dropped in to spend the evening." The old black Crow gave a jump when he heard that, for he was afraid as death of Mr. Cat, and he said quick as a wink, "Table's all full and no room for more. Table's all full and no room for more." Then he hurried over to the 'Coon's door and called, "Supper's all ready. Company's here. Come down." Mr. 'Coon put an extra chair against the door and said, "Who is your company, Mr. Crow?" "Oh, just home folks. Nobody but Mr. Dog. We've got fried chicken, and it's all on the table." "I'm sorry, Mr. Crow, but company just came here, too, and I'd have to bring him along." "Who is it, Mr. 'Coon?" "Only home folks. Just Mr. Hawk run in for the evening." Mr. Crow nearly fell over backward when he heard that. He had stolen some of Mr. Hawk's chickens the day before, and the 'Coon knew about it. The Hawk would surely know the flavor of his own chickens if he came down, and anyhow, Mr. 'Coon would tell him. So he called out just as quick as lightning, "Table's all full and no room for more. Table's all full and no room for more." Then he hurried right back to Mr. Dog and told him not to wait, because Mr. 'Coon and Mr. 'Possum could not come, and Mr. Dog laughed and pitched into the fried chicken and said it was the best joke and the best chicken he had ever heard of. But the Crow someway did not think it was as good a joke as he had expected, and could not eat his supper for looking up at the doors where the 'Possum and the 'Coon were. By and by, when Mr. Dog had finished his supper and had a smoke, he said he guessed his folks would be looking for him and that he would have to go. Then the Crow nearly had a fit and begged him to spend the evening. He said Mr. Dog came so seldom that he ought to stay, now he was there, so at last Mr. Dog sat down again and said he might as well sit a little longer, he supposed. Well, the Crow talked and told stories, and got Mr. Dog to telling stories too, and once he slipped around behind Mr. Dog while he was talking away and put the clock back, but it didn't do any good. Mr. Dog said by and by that he was obliged to go and that he was afraid now he would be locked out when he got home. So the Crow thought as quick as he could and called out loud, "Time company was going home. Time company was going home." But the 'Possum called back that his company wasn't in any hurry, and the 'Coon called back that his company wasn't in any hurry either. Then Mr. Crow was in a bad fix. He hopped around first on one foot and then on the other while Mr. Dog was putting on his things, and as soon as he was gone he skipped right up into his own room and locked the door tight. Mr. 'Coon and Mr. 'Possum were looking out of their windows and saw Mr. Dog outside as he lit his pipe and marched off laughing. And the 'Coon and the 'Possum laughed too, for they hadn't had any company at all, but had been making believe all the time. Then they unbarred their doors and went down into the parlor, where there was a lot of the supper left, and sat down and passed the fried chicken across to each other, and laughed some more, and said Mr. Crow was certainly a mighty good cook. "Didn't they give the Crow any?" asked the little lady, who had been so still that the storyteller believed her asleep. Pretty soon they did. They said it was too bad to punish him any longer, so they went up to his door, and the 'Possum knocked and said, "Better come down to supper, Mr. Crow. Company's all gone." And then the 'Coon, he knocked and said, "Better come down to fried chicken, Mr. Crow. Company's all gone." So then the Crow opened the door a little crack and peeked out, and when he saw nobody was there but the 'Coon and the 'Possum, he stepped out as brave as you please and said that he had been to one big supper and was sleepy and just going to bed, but that he believed he would sit down with them just to be sociable. He was sorry, he said, that he couldn't have asked them to bring down their company, but he hadn't fixed for so many, and after all it would be nicer now all alone together. So then the 'Coon and the 'Possum and the old black Crow all sat down to the table together and ate and ate and ate, and the old black Crow ate most of all. End of section 5.
Section number 6 of the Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Olson Freitag, Los Angeles. The Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book by Albert Bigelow Paine. Section number 6. The First Moon Story. A story in which Mr. 'Coon tells Mr. 'Possum and Mr. Rabbit something about the moon. Last night, when the full moon looked into the house of many windows, the little lady stood looking at it for a long time. She had been told that the moon was another world, and that the stars were worlds too, and she was trying to think how that could be when they looked so small and close together. Also, if it were all true, and they were so big, why they did not get against each other when the sky itself wasn't any bigger than the world and came down to it everywhere at the edges. She asked the storyteller about it when he came in. The storyteller tried to explain that the stars and moon were not so close together as they looked, and that some were a good deal further away than others, and a lot more things, all of which the little lady doubted, because she said she could see for herself that the sky was just a round blue ceiling, and that the moon and stars were right against it, and if any of them were further away than the others, they would be over beyond the ceiling and wouldn't show. This was a good deal easier for the storyteller to understand than the things he had been trying to tell, so he said, "Why, of course, I hadn't thought of that." And then he said he knew some stories about the moon that were a good deal truer, he guessed, than most anything else. And then he told her, first of all, Mr. 'Coon's story of the moon. Once upon a time, when Mr. Dog had invited the Crow and the Turtle to his house for supper, Jack Rabbit came over to the Hollow Tree to spend the evening with the 'Coon and the 'Possum, and they took a long walk. They walked and walked, till by and by they got to the edge of the world and sat down and hung their feet over and talked and looked at the full moon that was just rising. They talked first about one thing and then another, and then they got to talking about the moon, and come to find out one thought it was this and one thought it was that, and the third man, which was the 'Coon, said he knew it wasn't either one, for the moon had once belonged to his family, and he knew all about it. So then they agreed between them to let each one tell what he knew about the moon, and how he came to know it, and all about it. And Mr. 'Coon told first. "Well," he said, "a long time ago, about 16 great-great-grandfathers back, our family lived in a big woods in a big tree that was on top of a high mountain and touched the sky with its top limbs when the wind blew. It was a good big family, too. I don't know just how many there were, but I know there was an old grandmother besides the father and mother and a lot of children. They were a very noisy lot of youngsters, so the story goes, nearly all of the same age, and used to tear around the house and never want to do anything but play and run up and down stairs until my 16th great-great-grandmother used to stop her ears and say that those children would be the death of her, and she wished there was a school in the neighborhood so they could be sent to it. But those children never wanted to learn anything, and never thought about even knowing their letters until one day Father 'Coon came home from town with a brand new shiny tin plate with the alphabet around on the edge of it. When they saw that, They all made a grab for it and claimed it, but Father Coon held it up high and said that it was for the one that first learned his letters. He said that they were to take turns using it, a different one each time, and whoever was using it could study his letters while he was eating. He said that when it had been all around once, he would see who knew the most letters and would give it to him the next time, and so on, and the first one who knew all of them should have it for his own to keep. Well, the first night he gave it to a fellow named Bushy, and sat down by him and told him the letters over and over, and all the rest leaned across the table and looked on instead of eating, all except one fellow named Smart, who was good at learning things by heart, and he just listened and ate too. He did that right along every meal till it came his turn, and then he pretended to look very close, but all the time he was only saying the letters over and over in his head and laughing to himself to think how he was going to surprise everybody when the time came to see who knew the most. And that's just what he did do. For when the plate had gone clear around, and Father Coon called them all up one night after supper to see who could tell the most letters on it, some only knew 3, and some 4, and some of them knew 6, but when it came Smart's turn, he commenced when Father Coon pointed to A, and said every one clear through 2, and just as fast as he could say them. Then the others all began to cry, and Smart took the plate and walked off with it into the next room and sat down and was saying the alphabet over and over, when all at once Bushy happened to notice that when Smart pointed out the letters for himself and said them, he was just as apt to begin any place else as at A, and that he only knew them by heart and didn't know a single one when he saw it. Of course, that made Bushy mad, and he ran out and told the rest that Smart didn't know his alphabet at all, and that he couldn't even tell A when it was by itself, and all the others set up a great fuss too. They said he had to go out with the plate to Father Coon again, and Smart said he wouldn't do it, that it was his plate, and that he had said his letters once and didn't intend to say them again for anybody. Then Bushy grabbed the plate and said it was his because he knew 6 letters, and then a little fellow named Stripe grabbed it away from Bushy because he knew 6 letters too, and pretty soon they all got into a regular fight over it, and made such an awful noise that Grandmother Coon thought the tree was falling down, and came running in, and when she saw what they were fighting over, she grabbed it away from all of them, and opened the window and flung it out just as hard as ever she could fling it. And the tin plate went sailing and shining right straight up in the air, and kept on sailing and shining till it got to the sky. And then, of course, it couldn't get any further, but it went right on sailing and shining in the sky, and has been there sailing and shining ever since. And that, said Mr. Coon, that's the moon.
Oh, pshaw, said the possum. What made those dark spots on it? Said the rabbit.
Mr. Coon didn't know what to say to that just at first, and then he happened to think. Why, he said, that's where they rubbed the tin off fighting over it.
Nonsense, said the rabbit.
End of section 6. Recording by Linda Olson Freitag, Los Angeles. Section 7 of the Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Olson Freitag, Los Angeles. The Hollow Tree and Deep Woods Book by Albert Bigelow Paine. Section 7. The Second Moon Story. Mr. Possum has something to say about the moon which sheds new light on the subject. This is the story told by Mr. Possum when he and Mr. Coon and Jack Rabbit sat on the edge of the world and hung their feet over and looked at the moon. "Well," said Mr. Possum, "a good many years ago, when there were a great many more chickens than there are now, and Mr. Man took good care of them for us and let them roost in trees instead of locking them up every night in an unhealthy little pen, my folks used to go round sometimes after Mr. Man had gone to bed and look them over and pick out what they wanted for the next day. I don't know why we ever began the custom of picking out our victuals at night that way, when it was dark and dangerous, but somehow we always did it and have kept it up ever since." "Humph!" said the Coon. "Yes," continued Mr. Possum, "that was before there was any moon, and the nights were always dark. It wasn't a good time to choose food, and very often my folks made a mistake and got a 7-year-old bantam hen instead of a spring pullet, which is about the same size. This happened so much that by and by a very wise possum named Smooth said that if they would keep him in chickens of a youthful and tender sort, he would fix up a light so they could see and know what they were doing. They all agreed to do it, and that night Smooth built a big fire in the top of a tall tree and sat up there and tended to it until nearly morning. And my folks brought home the finest lot of chickens that Mr. Man had raised for them in a good many years. Well, there was never any trouble after that to pick out young meat, and Smooth kept the fire going nights and ate a good deal and got pretty fat, so that he didn't like to work, and kept planning some way to make his job easier. He wanted to find a light that he wouldn't have to tend to and keep piling wood on all night. He thought about this for a long time and used to fall asleep and dream about it, and once he let the fire go out and fell out of the tree and nearly gave up his job altogether. Well, while he was getting well, he had a good deal of company, and one day a top-knot crow named Dusk came to see him. Now you know that our friend Mr. Crow is a wise bird today, but in the old times a top-knot crow was wiser than anything that now flies or walks, and Dusk was a very old bird. He knew a great deal about Mr. Man and his ways, and he told Smooth that he had seen in Mr. Man's pantry, where he went sometimes, a light that would not go out during a whole night, and that had a big bright something behind it that would throw the light in any direction. Dusk, who used to carry off almost everything he saw, whether he wanted it or not, said that he thought he might carry this light off if Smooth would be willing to let him have a few chickens for a party he was going to give. Smooth told him he might take his pick out of his share of the chickens for the next 6 months if he would only bring that light, and Dusk didn't waste any time, but brought it the very next evening. It was a beautiful light, and Smooth fastened it to the tip-top of the tall tree so that it would swing in any direction, and the bright round thing behind it threw the light just where he wanted it. It burned oil, and he used to fill it up with chicken oil in the evening, and it would burn all night and make a better light than the fire ever did. So all he had to do was to keep it filled and turned in the direction that my folks were harvesting their chicken crop, and then he could go to bed and sleep all night if he wanted to. And that's just what he did do. And one night, while he was asleep, there came up a terrible storm. Of course, if Smooth had been awake, he would have taken the light down. But he wasn't awake, and the first he knew, he heard broken limbs falling and crashing all around, and he jumped up and ran out just in time to see the tip-top of the lamp tree break off, lamp and all, and go whirling round and round right straight up in the air till it got to the sky, and there it stuck fast. It never went out either, but kept on turning round and giving light in different directions at different times in the month. And that, said Mr. Possum, is the moon. And you don't always see it, because sometimes the bright reflecting thing is turned in the other direction. And when it's turned part way round, you see part of it. And it's always been so ever since that night Smooth went to sleep, and the storm came up and carried it off. "Humph!" said the 'Coon. "What makes those spots on it, then?" said the Rabbit. "Why," said Mr. Possum, thinking as quick as he could, those are some leaves that blew against the reflecting thing and stayed there." "Nonsense," said the Rabbit. End of section 7. Section 8 of the Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Olson Fytak, Los Angeles. The Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book by Albert Bigelow Paine. Section 8. On the Edge of the World. Mr. Rabbit has something to say about the moon, during which he explains the spots on it. This is the story that Mr. Jack Rabbit told to Mr. 'Coon and Mr. Possum when they sat together on the edge of the world and hung their feet over and looked at the moon. After Mr. Possum had finished his story, the Rabbit leaned back and swung his feet over the Big Nowhere a while, thinking. Then he began. "Well," he said, "my folks used to live in the moon." "Hm," said the 'Coon. "Nonsense," said the Possum. "Yes," said Jack Rabbit, "they did. The moon is a world away over on the other side of the Big Nowhere, and it doesn't stand still and stay topside up like this world, but keeps moving about and turning over, so that you have to look sharp and hang on tight to keep from falling off when it tips bottom side up or is standing on its edge as it is tonight. My folks used to live there, and Mr. Dog's folks used to live there too. That was a long time ago, before Mr. Dog ever went to live with Mr. Man, and he was big and savage and had no more manners than he has now. My folks never could and never did get along with Mr. Dog's folks worth a cent, but they could mostly beat Mr. Dog's folks running, so they didn't have to associate with them unless they wanted to. Of course, Mr. Dog's family didn't like that, for they thought they were just as good as we were, and they used to hide and watch for us, and when we came by, jump out and try to keep up with us for as much as 2 or 3 miles sometimes, just as Mr. Dog tried to keep up with me the other day, which you may remember." The Possum and 'Coon grinned to themselves and nodded. "Well," continued Mr. Rabbit, "there are some laws of etiquette, which means politeness, up there in the moon, and they are very strict. The old man in the moon makes these laws, and when one of them is broken, he makes the one that breaks it just go right on doing whatever it is for 999 years, and sometimes a good deal longer when it's a worse break than usual. Now, the very strictest of all these laws used to be the one about Mr. Dog trying to keep up with our folks. It was called the brush pile law. It didn't say that he couldn't keep up with us if he was able, but it did say that when we ran behind a brush pile, as we did sometimes, he must follow around the brush pile and never jump over it, no matter what happened. This was a hard law for Mr. Dog to keep, for he was mostly fat and excitable, and my folks would run around and around a brush pile as much as 100 times very often, and tie Mr. Dog so that he couldn't move. Then my folks would laugh and go home leisurely, while Mr. Dog would sneak off with his tongue hanging out till it dragged on the ground. Well, one day in the spring, when my family was out for an airing and a little sunshine, they got a good ways from home, and all of a sudden, here comes Mr. Dog and his whole family too. My folks didn't want anything to do with them, and set out for home in several directions, with Mr. Dog's folks following most all of them. My 21st great-great-grandfather was getting pretty old and couldn't run very fast, and there was a young, anxious-looking dog named Leap quite close behind him. So the first brush pile he came to, my relative paused, and when Leap came around one way, he went the other, and they kept that up until Leap got so mad and excited and worn out that he didn't care for the brush pile law or anything else except my 21st great-great-grandfather, and all of a sudden he gave a great big bark and a high jump right straight over the top of the brush pile, and just that second the moon tipped up on its edge, and all my folks and all Mr. Dog's folks came tumbling right down through the big nowhere to the earth, because they were all running and not holding on, all except Leap, who stayed right up in the air, according to law, and he has been there ever since. And when my folks and Mr. Dog's folks got down to the earth, they were all so scared that my folks ran in one direction and Mr. Dog's folks ran in another. The Dog family kept on running till they got to Mr. Man's house, and there they hid and stayed. And since that day, concluded Mr. Jack Rabbit, there has never been any of our family in the moon, and Leap is the only dog there. He's still jumping over the brush pile because he broke the law, and you can see him there any clear night when the moon sits up on its edge as it does now. And that's what those spots are, a dog jumping over a brush pile. It's just as plain as can be. The Possum and the 'Coon looked up at the full moon and said that the spots certainly did look a good deal like Mr. Dog jumping over a brush pile, but that the Rabbit couldn't prove his story any more than they could prove theirs, and that it wasn't any better story if it was as good. "Of course I can prove it," said the Rabbit. "There is an old adage about it, and you can prove anything by an old adage. It goes this way: the longest way is often best. Never jump over a cuckoo's nest." I don't know why it says cuckoo's nest, but I suppose cuckoos always used to build in brush piles in the moon, and maybe they do yet. Anyhow, it proves it. "Why, yes," said the 'Coon, "sure enough." "That's so, it does," said the Possum. End of section 8.
Section 9 of the Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book by Albert Bigelow Paine. Section 9. The First Pig Story. Mr. Crow spends a social evening with Mr. Dog. Once upon a time, said the storyteller, when the old black crow was visiting Mr. Dog. Was that the night that Mr. Rabbit and the rest told their moon stories? Interrupted the little lady. The very same night, and the crow and Mr. Dog got to telling stories too. They told pig stories, because they both knew a good deal about pigs, and Mr. Dog, being in his own house, let the crow tell first. Mr. Crow said he was going to tell a true story, so he lit his pipe and began this way. Mr. Crow's Story of the Little Pig. Well, said Mr. Crow, there was once a lot of little pigs that lived in a large pen with the big mother pig and were very fat and happy, all but one. This poor little fellow was what is called a runt pig, because he was not nearly so big as the others, nor so strong. They crowded him away at dinner time, so that he barely got enough to live on, and stayed small and thin, while the others grew every day fatter and fatter. At last the little runt pig made up his mind that he would run away and be a wild pig, such as he had heard his brothers and sisters talk about sometimes after supper. He thought about it a good deal, and one morning bright and early he started. Being so little, he squeezed through a small hole in the back of the pen, and then ran away very fast, without stopping to look behind. He ran and ran straight across the barnyard, where there were some chickens scratching, and out into a big field. When he got so tired that he could go no further, he stopped for a little, and then ran on again. He had to go a long way, but by and by he saw a lot of trees, and said, "Oh, here's the woods! Now I'll be a wild pig." So he squeezed between two boards that made a crack in the fence, and under the trees he saw a lot of ripe peaches and apples, for he was in a big orchard. It was just peach time, and the little pig was very hungry. So he ate and ate, first a lot of peaches, and then a lot of apples, then a lot more peaches, and then a good many more apples. Then he picked out only the ripest and finest apples and peaches as he came to them, and ate and kept on eating until he had pains in his stomach and began squealing for his mother. "Oh, oh, oh!" he squealed. "I am going right home." But when he came to the fence he had eaten so much fruit that he could not get through the crack again, and stuck fast half-way. Then he squealed louder than ever, and pretty soon somebody said, "Why, here's a little pig fast in the fence." And Mr. Man came through the orchard, and took hold of the little pig's hind legs and pressed the boards apart so's not to hurt him. "Whose pig are you, I want to know?" he said as he pulled him out. Then Mr. Man took the little pig under his arm, and went back through the orchard with him to his house. "Here's a little runt pig I found stuck fast in our fence," he said to Mrs. Man when he got there. "He's eaten too many apples and peaches, I should think, by the way he looks and squeals." Then he fixed up a nice box for him, with clean straw in it, and gave him some warm milk in a pan. By and by the little pig went to sleep. Every day Mr. Man and his wife brought him nice things to eat, and soon the little pig grew so fat that they had to put him in a larger pen. Then they fed him still more, and, being all alone, he ate just as much as he wanted. So he grew and grew, fatter and fatter, and every few weeks they had to put him in a larger pen, until people came from all over the country to see what a beautiful large pig he was. Then, by and by, there was a fair where all the fine pigs were taken for show, and Mr. Man and Mrs. Man and the little runt pig all went to the fair, But the little pig wasn't a little runt pig any more, for he took the first prize for being the largest and finest pig at the fair. End of Section 9. Recorded by Céline Major. Section 10 of the Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book by Albert Bigelow Paine. Section 10. The Second Pig Story. Mr. Dog tells of another runaway who has a strange adventure. When Mr. Crow had finished the story about the little runt pig, Mr. Dog nodded, and said that was a good story, and that he knew the mate to it. So then he filled up his pipe too, and lit it, and leaned back and told the story about Curly the Runaway. "This," said Mr. Dog, "is the story of a saucy pig, a saucy fat pig, with a curly tail. He wasn't good to his sisters and brothers, and was greedy, and not very clean either, because he wouldn't wear his bib at the table, and often grabbed things and tipped them over, instead of being polite and taking what his mother put on his plate. Besides this, the saucy pig, who was called Curly, used to boast of how strong he was, and how fast he could run, and how far he could jump, and when he heard some story about a little runt pig who ran away and made his fortune, the same one you told, perhaps, he went around boasting that he could do that any day, and that he could run twice as far as any little runt pig, and get twice as fat, and take twice as big a prize at the fair. Well, he talked and bragged about it so much that by and by he really believed he could do everything he said, and made up his mind to run away sure enough. He didn't creep out through a hole and slip away, as your little pig did, but took a pretty valise that he had got for Christmas, and put all his things in it, and some of his brothers' and sisters' things, too, and then put on his best suit, and walked out the front door, as big as you please, with the others all looking at him and wishing they were as big and strong as Curly, so they could go too, or take their playthings away from him, they didn't care which. Then one of them ran back and said, 'Oh, Ma, Curly's running away! Curly's running away, Ma, and he's taken our things!' But Curly's mother didn't worry much. 'Oh, well, just let him go,' she said. 'He'll be back quick enough.' Then she took her afternoon nap, and Curly walked out across the meadow, sniffing the sunshine and talking to himself about what he was going to do. Then he remembered that the little runt pig had run, and Curly thought he ought to run some too, but he was so fat he couldn't run far, and had to sit down to rest, and then he walked on again and kept walking until he thought he must be almost to the edge of the world, which his mother had told him was just beyond the woods. He was getting very tired, when all at once he came to a gate and looked up, and there was an orchard full of ripe apples and peaches, just as the little runt pig had found. The cracks in the fence were too small for him to try to get through, but he thought he could wiggle under the gate. So he got down in the dust with his new clothes and wiggled and wriggled, but he couldn't get through, and when he tried, he couldn't get back either. Then he began to squeal. He could squeal louder than any two other pigs almost, and by Mr. Man, who was working in the next field, heard him and came running. When Curly heard Mr. Man coming, he thought, "Now he'll take me home and make me a great pig, just as he did the little runt pig." But Mr. Man didn't. "Here, you rascal," he said, "what are you doing under my gate? I'll fix you." Then he picked up a long, scratchy stick and commenced to beat Mr. Curly, first on one side and then on the other, till he squealed and howled so loud that you could hear him almost a mile. Then Mr. Man caught him by the leg and opened the gate and pulled him out. "Now you go home," he said, and Curly started, but he was so frightened that he didn't know where home or any place else was, and he scampered off without his hat or playthings, and ran and ran and ran till he almost dropped. And just then, when one of my family, who had been digging out a mole, happened to see the pig running and took after him and caught him and dragged him round and round by the ear till Mr. Man came running and parted them and held my relative by the collar while he pushed Curly with his foot in the other direction. "Now I guess you'll go home," he said, and Curly thought so too, and limped off, trying to run. It was such a long way back home that it seemed as if he never would get there. Every minute he thought he heard my cousin coming after him, but he couldn't run any more to save his life, and his ear was bleeding and hurt him, and he cried and squealed, and when at last he did get home, he slipped in the back way and tried to wash his face and brush his clothes before they saw him, but they all saw him come in, with his sore ear and his nice new clothes all torn and dirty. Then they began to laugh and point at him and said, "Oh, here comes Curly the runaway. He's been to the fair and brought home the red ribbon on his ear." And that was the very meanest thing they could say, for, of course, they meant the red blood on his ear, and poor Curly ran to his mother and cried and sobbed as if his heart would break, and said he would never, never run away again as long as he lived. And I've heard, concluded Mr. Dog, that he never did. End of Section 10. Read by Céline Major. Section 11 of the Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book by Albert Bigelow Paine. Section 11. Mr. Dog takes lessons in dancing. Jack Rabbit plays one more joke on Mr. Dog. After Mr. Dog had finished his pig story, he and Mr. Crow got to talking over old times, and telling what happened to them when they were boys, and how everything had changed, and how young fellows now had things pretty much their own way and no trouble to get an education. Mr. Crow said that he believed if he'd had half a chance when he was young he'd have made an artist. He said he used to draw off likenesses on his slate so that anybody could almost tell who they were, and that the 'Coon and the 'Possum each had in their rooms in the big hollow tree pictures of themselves that he had drawn which were just as good to-day as the day they were made. Mr. Dog thought it was mighty fine to be talented like that. He said that his early education had been neglected, too, and that he knew he might have been a poet, for he could make rhymes just as easy as falling off a log, and that he knew 3 rhymes for every word he could think of except silver and orange. Of course, it was too late now, and he had mostly given up poetry and thought some of going into society. All he needed was good clothes and a few instructions in manners and some dancing lessons. He said he was just as young and just as good-looking as he ever was, and that in a few days he'd have some new clothes. Then he asked Mr. Crow if he knew of anybody that would give him some lessons in politeness and dancing. Mr. Crow thought a while, and then said that he didn't know of a soul in the neighborhood that could be so polite and dance as well as Mr. Jack Rabbit, and that he didn't suppose Mr. Rabbit and Mr. Dog were on good terms. That made Mr. Dog feel pretty bad, 'cause he knew it was just that way, and by he got Mr. Crow to promise that he would go and call on Jack Rabbit next morning and see if he couldn't fix it up somehow for him to take a few lessons. So next morning Mr. Crow called over to see Mr. Rabbit, and found him making soap out in the back yard. He had a good fire built between some stones and a big kettle full of brown stuff, which he was stirring with a long stick. He seemed to be feeling pretty well, for he kept singing, "Fire and stir and grease and lye, soap to scrub with by and by." "Oh," said the little lady. "Do they make soap like that?" "They used to in old times. They made what they called a lye by running water through new wood ashes, and then they put grease in it and boiled it in a big kettle. It was a very strong soap, and people didn't wash their hands with it, because it got into sore places and burnt and stung like fury. But they used it a good deal to scrub with, and Jack Rabbit made it himself because he was smart and knew how. Well, the Crow told him all about what Mr. Dog had said, and Mr. Rabbit kept stirring and singing kind of soft-like to himself, and smiling a little, and by, when the Crow was done, he said that of course Mr. Dog wasn't very polite, and that some lessons would certainly do him good. As for dancing, he said that if Mr. Dog would promise to do just as he told him he would be able to dance as many as 3 different steps in less than 5 minutes after he got there. Mr. Crow said that Mr. Dog had promised anything, and that he would send him over that very afternoon. And, sure enough, right after dinner, here comes Mr. Dog lickety-split to take lessons. Jack Rabbit had his door locked and his window open, and was sitting by it and looking out when Mr. Dog got there. He told Mr. Dog to sit right down and catch his breath a little, and then the lessons would begin. His kettle of soap was all done, and he had taken it off the fire, but the fire wasn't out yet, though it looked as if it was, because it had burned down to coals and white ashes. Mr. Rabbit had his new soap in the house, and he spread some of it on a cloth and tossed it down to Mr. Dog. "That's a dance plaster," he said, "but you don't put it on quite yet. The first thing will be some lessons in politeness. You must look straight at me and do just as I tell you." Mr. Dog said that he would do that, and took a seat facing Mr. Rabbit and paid close attention. Then Jack Rabbit got up and bowed politely, as if he were meeting ladies, and, of course, took a step or 2 backward as he bowed, and then Mr. Dog bowed and took some steps backwards, too. And then he sat down, and Mr. Rabbit told him just where his mistakes were, and made him do it over and over until Mr. Dog had bowed and scraped and backed himself almost into the fire, though he didn't know it. Next, Jack Rabbit said they'd have a lesson in paying compliments and then the dancing. Now, whenever anybody pays a compliment to Mr. Dog, he always wags his tail. So the Rabbit thought of the very finest compliment he could think of and paid it to Mr. Dog, and Mr. Dog forgot that it was only a lesson, and was so happy to receive such a compliment from Mr. Jack Rabbit that he wagged his tail a great big wag sideways and then up and down, until all at once he gave a howl and jumped straight up in the air, for he had pounded his tail right into the ashes and hot coals of Mr. Rabbit's fire. "Did it burn him much?" asked the little lady. "It did that, and he howled and jumped up and down and whirled first one way and then the other, and Jack Rabbit leaned out of the window and held his sides and said, 'That's it, that's the step. Dance, Mr. Dog, dance.'" When Mr. Dog heard that, he thought the Rabbit was really in earnest and didn't know perhaps he had wagged his tail into the fire, so he quit howling and really tried to do a few fancy steps, and Jack Rabbit almost died trying to keep from laughing, but he managed to do it, and he called out to Mr. Dog that he was doing fine, and that all he needed now was the dance plaster on his tail. When Mr. Dog heard that, he thought perhaps a dance plaster would take the smart away, too, and he sat right down and tied it on tight. And then pretty soon that soft soap began to act, and right then, of all the howling and dancing and performance that you ever heard of, Mr. Dog did it. Mr. Rabbit couldn't hold in any longer, and lay back in his chair and laughed and rolled on his bed and shouted, and when Mr. Dog heard him he knew he had been fooled again, and he took off over the hill toward home a good deal faster than he came. Every little ways he'd stop to dance and perform, and try to get that plaster off his tail, and every time he stopped Jack Rabbit would sing out, "That's a new step, Mr. Dog, you're doing fine. Dance, Mr. Dog, dance." And for a long time after that Mr. Dog didn't like to go out much, because everywhere he went somebody would be sure to say to him, "That's a new step, Mr. Dog. Dance, Mr. Dog, dance." End of Section 11. Read by Céline Major. Section 12 of the Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book by Albert Bigelow Paine. Section 12. Mr. Rabbit's Unwelcome Company. Mr. Polecat makes a morning call, and Mr. Dog drops in. "I think I shall have to tell you about Mr. Polecat," said the story-teller, "and about his visit to Mr. Rabbit." "Who's Mr. Polecat?" said the Little Lady. "You never told me about him before." "Well, no, because you see Mr. Polecat is so queer in some of his ways that people even don't talk about him a great deal. He is really quite a nice gentleman, though, when he doesn't get excited. But when he does he loses friends. The trouble is with the sort of perfumery he uses when he gets excited, just as some people use a smelling bottle, and nobody seems to like the sort Mr. Polecat uses except himself. I suppose he must like it or he wouldn't be so free with it. But other people go away when he uses it, mostly in the direction the wind's blowing from, and in a hurry, as if they were afraid they'd miss a train. Even Mr. Dog doesn't stop to argue with Mr. Polecat. Nobody does, and all the other deep woods people do their best to make him happy and to keep him in good humour whenever he comes about, and give him their nicest things to eat and a lot to carry home with him, so he'll start just as soon as possible. But more than anything they try to keep him from saying anything about Mr. Dog, or hinting or even thinking about Mr. Dog, for when he does any of these things he's apt to get excited, and then sometimes he opens up that perfume of his and his friends fall over each other to get out of reach. They're never very happy to see him coming, and they're always glad to see him go, even when he's had a quiet visit and goes pretty soon, which is just what didn't happen one time when he came to call on Jack Rabbit, and it's that time I'm going to tell you about. Mr. Rabbit looked out his door one morning, and there was Mr. Polecat, all dressed up, coming to see him. He wasn't very far off, either, and Mr. Rabbit hardly had time to jerk down a crayon picture of Mr. Dog that he'd made the day before, just for practice. He pushed it under the bed quick, and when Mr. Polecat came up he bowed and smiled, and said what a nice day it was, and that he'd bring a chair outside if Mr. Polecat would like to sit there instead of coming in where it wasn't so pleasant. But Mr. Polecat said he'd guessed he'd come in, as it was a little chilly and he didn't feel very well anyway. So he came inside, and Jack Rabbit gave him his best chair, and brought out a little table and put a lot of nice things on it that Mr. Polecat likes, and began right away to pack a basket for him to take home. But Mr. Polecat didn't seem to be in any hurry to go. He ate some of the nice things, and then leaned back to talk and smoke, and told Mr. Rabbit all the news he'd heard as he came along, and Mr. Rabbit got more and more worried, for he knew that just as likely as not Mr. Polecat had heard something about Mr. Dog and would begin to tell it pretty soon, and then no knowing what would happen. So Jack Rabbit just said yes and no, and began to talk about Mr. Robin, because Mr. Robin was a good friend of everybody, and nobody could get excited just talking about Mr. Robin. But Mr. Polecat says, "Oh, yes, I saw Mr. Robin as I came along, and he called to me that Mr. Dog," and then Jack Rabbit changed the subject as quick as he could and spoke about Mr. Squirrel, and Mr. Polecat says, "Oh, did you hear how Mr. Squirrel went over to Mr. Man's house and saw Mr. Dog there?" And then poor Mr. Rabbit had to think quick and change the subject again to the Hollow Tree people, and Mr. Polecat said, "Oh, yes, I stopped by that way as I came along, and they called out to me from upstairs how you were practising drawing, and that you gave Mr. Dog some dancing lessons the other day, and then made a fine picture of him just as he looked when he danced into the hot coals, so I hurried right over here for just to see that picture." Poor Mr. Rabbit! He didn't know what to do. He knew right away that the Hollow Tree people had told about the picture to get rid of Mr. Polecat, and he made up his mind that he'd get even with them some day for getting him in such a fix. But some day was a long ways off, and Mr. Polecat was right there under his nose, so Mr. Rabbit said, just as quick as he could say it, that the Hollow Tree people were always making jokes, and that the picture was just as poor as it could be, and that he'd be ashamed to show it to anybody, much more to a talented gentleman like Mr. Polecat. But that made Mr. Polecat all the more anxious to see it, for he was sure Mr. Rabbit was only modest, and pretty soon he happened to spy the edge of the picture frame under Mr. Rabbit's bed, and just reached under and pulled it out, before Mr. Rabbit could help himself. Well, he picked up that picture and looked at it a minute, and Jack Rabbit began to back off toward the door and say a few soothing words, when all at once Mr. Polecat leaned back and commenced to laugh and laugh at the funny picture Mr. Dog made where Mr. Rabbit called to him, "Dance, Mr. Dog, dance." And then, of course, Mr. Rabbit felt better, for if his company thought it was funny and laughed, there wasn't so much danger. "Why," said Mr. Polecat, "it's the best thing I ever saw. You could almost imagine that Mr. Dog himself was right here, howling and barking and dancing." "Oh, no, hardly that," said Mr. Rabbit. "Of course I suppose it is a little like him, but it's not at all as if he were here, you know, not at all. And he's ever so far off, I'm sure, and won't come again for a long time. You know he's—" "Oh, yes, it is," declared Mr. Polecat. "It's just as if he were right here. And I can just hear him howl and bark and—" And right there Mr. Polecat stopped and Mr. Rabbit stopped, and both of them held their breath and listened, for sure enough they did hear Mr. Dog howling and barking and coming toward the house as straight as he could come. Jack Rabbit gave a jump right up in the air and hollered, "Run, Mr. Polecat, run, and go the back way." But Mr. Polecat never runs from anybody. He doesn't have to. He just opens up that perfume of his, and the other people do the running. So Mr. Rabbit gave one more jump, and this time he jumped straight up the chimney, and didn't stop till he got to the roof, where he found a loose board and put it over the chimney quick and sat down on it. Then he called to Mr. Dog, who was coming lickety-split through the woods. "Why, how are you, Mr. Dog? Glad to see you. Walk right in. There's company downstairs. Just make yourself at home till I come down." You see, there was no use to stop him now, because Mr. Rabbit could tell by what was coming up the chimney that it was too late, and he wanted Mr. Dog to get a good dose of it as well as himself. And Mr. Dog did come just as hard as he could tear, for the wind was blowing toward the house, and he couldn't detect anything wrong until he gave a great big jump into Mr. Rabbit's sitting room and right into the midst of the most awful smell that was ever turned loose in the Big, Deep Woods. Well, it took Mr. Dog so suddenly that he almost fainted away. Then he gave a howl, as if a wagon had run over his tail, and tumbled out of that sitting room and set out for home without once stopping to look behind him. Then Mr. Rabbit laughed and called, "Come back, Mr. Dog! Come back and stay with us. Mr. Polecat's going to spend a week with me. Come back and have a good time." But Mr. Dog didn't stop, and he didn't seem to hear, and by Mr. Polecat called up that he was going home, and that Mr. Rabbit could come down now, for Mr. Dog was gone and wouldn't come back, he guessed. But Mr. Rabbit said no, he didn't feel very well, and guessed he'd stay where he was for the present, and that if Mr. Polecat was going he might leave both doors open and let the wind draw through the house, because he always liked to air his house after Mr. Dog had been to see him. Then Mr. Polecat took his basket and went, and Jack Rabbit didn't come down for a long time, and when he did, he couldn't stay in his house for the awful smell. So he went over to stay a week with the Hollow Tree people, and his clothes didn't smell nice either, but they had to stand it, and Mr. Rabbit said it served them right for getting him into such a fix. It was over a week before he could go back to his house again, and even then it wasn't just as he wanted it to be, and he aired it every day for a long time. But there was one thing that made him laugh, and that was when he heard from Mr. Robin how Mr. Dog got home and Mr. Man wouldn't have him about the house or even in the yard, but made him stay out in the woods for as much as 10 days, until he got rid of every bit of Mr. Polecat's nice perfumery. End of Section 12. Read by Céline Major. Section 13 of the Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book by Albert Bigelow Paine. Section 13. How Mr. Dog Got Even. The forest friends prepare for a May party and arrange for a quiet time. Well, yes, said the storyteller, Mr. Dog did have a good deal of trouble, and it makes me sorry for him sometimes when I think about it. He still kept good friends with the Crow and the Turtle, though, and was on pretty fair terms with Mr. Robin and most all the rest of the bird family, besides living in the same yard with Mr. Man, who always kept an eye on him and got him out of trouble when he could. Of course, Jack Rabbit and the Hollow Tree people mostly got the best of Mr. Dog, but there was one time when they didn't. This is how it happened. Once upon a time, Mr. Jack Rabbit was spending the evening over at the big hollow tree with the Crow and the 'Coon and the 'Possum. They had all had their supper, and were leaning back and talking about the weather and what a late spring it had been, and how bad the cold rains were for the young chickens. Mr. Rabbit didn't care for chickens himself, but he usually kept some for his friends, and always had a nice patch of young clover and some garden vegetables for his own use. He said the late frost had killed his early lettuce and young cabbage plants, and that his clover patch looked as if a fire had been through it. Mr. 'Coon smoked a little and looked into the fire and said that he guessed tomorrow would be a warm day, and the Crow said he knew it would be because he could feel it in his leg, where a stray shot from Mr. Man's gun happened to hit him once when he was taking a walk in Mr. Man's cornfield just about this time of year. The 'Possum put his thumbs in the armholes of his vest and leaned back against the mantel and said he had a plan he wanted to tell them about. When he said that, they all kept still to listen, because they knew when the 'Possum had a plan it always meant something good to eat, and they were always ready to hear about good things to eat, even when they'd just got up from the supper table. Mr. 'Possum puffed a few puffs of smoke, and then he went on to say that after so much bad weather in April, he thought it would be proper for them to give an outdoor feast and woods party on the first day of May. All the others spoke up right off and said that was just the thing. Then they all began talking at once about what each would bring and whom they should invite. Jack Rabbit said he would invite Mr. Chipmunk and Mr. Quail, and that he would speak a piece composed for the occasion. The 'Coon said he would invite Mr. Fox, because he had the best chickens and would bring a basket of them along. The 'Possum said that would be a good plan, and that they ought to try as much as they could to invite people that would bring things. That made the Crow laugh, and he said if they wanted to do that they might invite Mr. Man himself. Of course, all the others laughed at first when they heard that, and then, all at once, they quit laughing. For speaking of Mr. Man made them think of Mr. Dog, and they knew how he was always traipsing around the country where he wasn't wanted, and just as likely as not would walk right in on them at dinner time and make it unpleasant for everybody. They all felt pretty lonesome when they thought of that, and then the Crow laughed again, and said he would send over a note by Mr. Robin to Mr. Dog, inviting him to go and see some friends of his that had just moved across the wide grasslands. He said Mr. Dog would be glad to go, and that his friends would be glad to see him, and that it would take all day to make the trip and do no harm to anybody. Then all of them felt well again. Mr. Crow wrote the note right away, and when he invited the Robin to the May party next morning he asked him if he would take Mr. Dog's invitation over to him and slip it under his door before he was up. He said it was to be a surprise for Mr. Dog, and didn't want him to know just who sent the invitation. He didn't tell the Robin that it was an invitation for Mr. Dog to get out of the country, because the Robin is a good bird and wouldn't help to deceive anybody for the world. Mr. Robin was tickled most to death at his own invitation, and slipped Mr. Dog's in his pocket, and hurried off with it just as fast as ever he could. He was so excited that he forgot he had a hole in the pocket of his coat, and never thought of it till he got to Mr. Man's yard, where Mr. Dog's house was. Then he remembered all at once, and when he felt for the invitation and turned his pocket inside out, there was the hole all right, but the invitation was gone. Mr. Robin at first didn't know what to do. Then he happened to think that all Mr. Crow had said was that he didn't want Mr. Dog to know just who sent it to him, so he went right up to Mr. Dog's house and rapped. Mr. Dog came out yawning, but when he heard that he was invited to a May party he forgot that he'd ever had any trouble in his life, and danced and rolled over and wagged his tail, till the Robin thought he was having a fit. Then when Mr. Dog heard that the party was gotten up mostly on his own account, and was to be a kind of surprise, he had another fit, and said he never was so happy in the world. Mr. Robin said he couldn't tell him just who sent the invitation, but he told him a few of those invited, and Mr. Dog grew 6 inches taller, and said he must certainly have some more new clothes for a party like that. Then Mr. Robin set off home to get ready, for there were only 2 days more in April, and everybody had to scramble around to be ready in time, especially Mr. Jack Rabbit, who had to write a poem. Over at Mr. Fox's house the feathers were flying, and at the hollow tree Mr. Crow had his sleeves rolled up, baking all day long. The 'Coon sat in his room and rocked and planned games, and the 'Possum followed Mr. Crow about and told him new things to cook. Everywhere in the woods, and even out in the wide grass lands, folks were staying up nights to get ready, but none of them felt as happy or took as much trouble to look well as Mr. Dog. He knew there couldn't be any joke this time, because Mr. Robin had invited him, and Mr. Robin wouldn't play a joke on anybody. Every little while he would go out and roll on the grass in the sun and then go in and put on his new clothes and stand before the glass. Then he would march up and down and try to see if his coat wrinkled under the arms and if his trousers fitted neatly around the waist. As he thought the party was to be given for him, of course he wasn't expected to bring anything except all the style he could put on, and when the morning came Mr. Dog did put on all he could carry, and took one more look at himself in the glass and started. He had never felt so happy in his life. End of Section 13. Read by Céline Major. Section 14 of the Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Hollow Tree and Deep Woods book by Albert Bigelow Paine. Section 14. How Mr. Dog Got Even. Continued. The Surprise of Mr. Rabbit and Others. Poor Mr. Dog! He did not dream that the Robin had made a big mistake when he invited him. He was all ready for a grand time and thought he was to be the guest of honor. But the 'Coon and the 'Possum and all the rest thought he was in another part of the country that day, and when they got to the place where the party was to be they shook hands and laughed about how Mr. Crow had played it on Mr. Dog, and then rolled on the grass and cut up in a great way. Mr. Fox was there with all his folks, and Mr. Squirrel and his folks, and Mr. Weasel, and Mr. Woodchuck, and Mrs. Quail, and ever so many others. Mr. Rabbit had picked out the spot, which was a pretty, green, open place in the woods, and right in the center of it a little weeping willow tree, with long, trailing branches like ribbons. This was to be their Maypole, and they were so happy that they commenced dancing almost as soon as they got there. Mr. Dog, of course, hadn't arrived yet. It had taken him so long to dress, and then he had a long way to come, so he was late. Pretty soon Mr. 'Possum puffed and blowed because he was so fat, and said he thought they ought to sit right down and begin to eat, and let Mr. Jack Rabbit read his poem to them through the first course. The Rabbit was willing to do that, for he would rather read his own poetry than eat any time, and besides, the first course was something he didn't like very well. So then they all sat down around the tablecloth which they had spread on the grass, and Mr. Rabbit got up and put his right hand in the breast of his coat. He commenced by saying that his friends seemed to think he was a good deal of a poet, but that he had always been too busy to really write his best, and that all his poems, like the one he was just about to read, had been little inspirations tossed off on the spur of the moment. Of course, everybody there knew that Jack Rabbit had sat up 2 whole days and nights to write his poem, but they all cheered and clapped their hands, and Mr. Rabbit bowed and coughed a little and began to read. "When Mr. Dog's Away," by J. Rabbit. "Oh, 'tis happy in the woodland when Mr. Dog's away. 'Tis happy in the woodland up on the 1st of May. He's gone across the grassland. We hope he's gone to stay. Then don't forget the feast is set and Mr. Dog's away." The Robin was just about to speak up at this moment and say that Mr. Dog was surely coming, but the others cheered so that nobody heard him, and Mr. Rabbit went on with his poem. "Then 'tis hey for Mr. Woodchuck, and 'tis hi for Mrs. Quail, and 'tis ho for Mr. 'Possum with a bowknot on his tail. Then 'tis hip for Mr. Robin, and for all the rest, hooray! The friends are met, the feast is set, and Mr. Dog's away." "Hooray! Hooray!" shouted all the others. "The friends are met, the feast is set, and Mr. Dog's away." "Then hand around the glasses, and fill them to the brim, and drink a health to Mr. Dog, for we are fond of him. And though he be not present, upon this happy day, we'll fill the cup and drink it up to Mr. Dog away." At the last line everybody was just about to lift their glasses and give a great big cheer for the poem, when all at once they saw by Jack Rabbit's face that something was wrong. Then they all looked where he was looking, and there, right before them, bowing and smiling, stood Mr. Dog himself. He had just come in time to hear the last stanza of the poem, and was ready to dance with joy, he was so happy to think they were drinking his health when he wasn't there. He felt so good that he didn't notice how surprised they looked, and slipped into a seat at the table, saying he was sorry to be late, and that he had just heard the last lines of Mr. Rabbit's poem, but that they had made him very proud and happy, and he hoped Mr. Jack Rabbit would read it again for his benefit. Of course, nearly everybody there was scared almost into fits, but they didn't dare let on, for they saw that there had been an awful mistake somewhere, and if Mr. Dog found it and knew he hadn't been invited no telling what might happen. Jack Rabbit smiled, kind of sickly like, and said that he had been overcome by the excitement and didn't feel quite able to read the poem again. He said he hoped Mr. Dog would judge the first verses, though, by the last, and feel just as glad to be there as they were to have him. And all the rest said, "Oh, yes, so glad to have Mr. Dog with us," and kept piling things on his plate so he wouldn't want anything to eat besides his dinner. Mr. Dog felt so well, and was in such a good humor, that he commenced pretty soon to tell stories and jokes on himself, and by told about the time he went over to take dancing lessons of Jack Rabbit. Everybody thought at first that they'd better laugh at Mr. Dog's jokes, and they did laugh, like everything. But when he started that story about what Mr. Rabbit had done to him they didn't know whether to laugh or not. Some laughed a little and some didn't, and Mr. Rabbit said he thought it was getting a little too warm for him there in the sun, and he believed he'd go and sit in the shade a minute and cool off, so he went over behind some waxberry bushes where it was shady, and the minute he got where Mr. Dog couldn't see him he set out for home just about as fast as he could travel, without stopping to say good-by or to look behind him. Pretty soon Mr. 'Coon said he thought maybe Mr. Rabbit was sicker than he let on, and he guessed he'd better go and see about it. So he went over behind the waxberry bushes, too, and was halfway home before you could say Jack Robinson. Then Mr. 'Possum told Mr. Crow that he hoped he and the others would entertain Mr. Dog a while, for he knew Mr. 'Coon would need help, and away he went, and before long Mr. Fox and Mr. Woodchuck and Mr. Squirrel and all their folks had gone over behind the waxberry bushes to look after Mr. Rabbit, too, and none of them wasted a minute's time making tracks for home as soon as they got out of sight. But the Crow and the Turtle and the Robin didn't go, because they were all on good terms with Mr. Dog. Mrs. Quail didn't go either, though before long most everybody else had gone. Then Mr. Crow said he guessed poor Mr. Rabbit's friends had taken him home, and Mr. Dog said he was sorry, and that it was too bad anything should happen that way when folks were having such a good time. He said he'd call at Jack Rabbit's house next day to see how he was and hear the rest of that poem. Then Mr. Crow and Mr. Turtle laughed and laughed, and Mr. Dog didn't know what they were laughing at, but he felt so well that he laughed too, and Mr. Robin, who had found out by this time what a bad mistake he had made, couldn't help laughing some himself. Then they had dessert, and Mr. Dog made a speech and thanked them for the fine party and surprise in his honor, and declared he had never spent such a happy day in all his life. He said there had been a little misunderstanding now and then between himself and some of the forest folks, but he knew now that all was forgiven, and that he would never forget this happy May party. And Mr. Dog never did forget it, concluded the story teller, at least not for a long time, and he doesn't know to this day that the party wasn't given specially for him, or that Mr. Jack Rabbit's poem wasn't written in his honor. "You can sing the Hollow Tree song now," said the little lady drowsily. So then the story teller sang the song that the forest people sing when, on dark nights in the far depths of the deep woods, they are feasting at the table of the 'Coon, the 'Possum and the old black Crow. Long before he had finished, the little lady was in the land of dreams, and the story teller had been dreaming too while he sang the Hollow Tree song. "Oh, there was an old 'Possum in the big deep woods, as fat as a 'possum could be, and he lived in a hollow, 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 hollow. He lived in a hollow tree. Oh, there was an old 'Coon in the big deep woods, as sly as a 'Coon could be, and he lived in a hollow, 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 hollow. He lived in a hollow tree. Oh, there was an old Crow in the big deep woods, as black as a crow could be, and he lived in a hollow, 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 hollow. He lived in a hollow tree. For they all lived together in the big deep woods, as you can plainly see, and the 'Possum made one, and the 'Coon made two, and the old black Crow made three. And here's to the 'Possum and the old black Crow and the 'Coon with a 1, 2, 3. And here's to the hollow, 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 hollow. And here's to the hollow tree." End of section 14. Read by Céline Major.